Okay, Jeff, it looks to be about 4 minutes after, so we can get going. Welcome, everybody. My name's Toby Farley. I'm from the Philmont Library, and welcome to this evening's program. It's one of our series with Jeff Urban here from the FDR Presidential Museum and Library in Hyde Park. And tonight the topic is Pearl Harbor, I believe. So welcome. And just to remind you of a few things. Number one, the program is being recorded and it will be on our websites. It will be on the Philmont, Claverick, Rogen, and Hudson Labs websites. And also there will be a question and answer at the end. You can either put your question in the chat box or the question and answer box. And we will be keeping an eye on that, but we will answer all of those at the end. And if you are watching with someone with you and only logged in as one person, let us know that in the chat box so that we can keep count of how many people come to the programs. Thanks so much. Jeff, it's all you.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I hope your holiday preparations are going well. It's a little hard to get into Christmas when it was 50 degrees out today, but I will definitely take the warm weather. You don't have to shovel sunshine. You do have to shovel snow. So tonight we're going to talk about a date that will live in infamy. The attack at Pearl Harbor, which we commemorated the 80th anniversary of last week on December 7th, last Tuesday. And what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about Roosevelt's role in this monumental event, not just in American history, but in world history as well, and address some of the controversies that took place around Pearl Harbor, tell you how it happened, and then we can open it up to some questions and answers from there. So every late November, early December, we start getting emails, we start getting phone calls at the Roosevelt Library, wanting to know, why did FDR let the attack at Pearl Harbor happen? Why did he let this thing happen? And nothing could be further from the truth. There's this big conspiracy out there that FDR let the attack happen at Pearl Harbor so that we could get into the war. That he was looking for an excuse to get into the war, and these are just simply not the facts. So what I'd like to do tonight is to share with you what the facts are, and we can see why. And I'll show you why there's a misconception about this. The folks that do have this conspiracy do have some evidence that they point to, but it's not necessarily valid evidence. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So the big question is, did FDR know about the attack? Did he have warning about the attack? And the answer to that is sort of. Okay, there were conflicting reports that there were likely to be attacks, at any American naval base anywhere in the Pacific Rim. Keep in mind the Pacific Rim is a huge area. There were also outdated reports that were floating around, and there was reports that even if he did know about the attack, even if he did know that we were likely to be attacked at Pearl Harbor, what did he do to prevent that, or what did he do to minimize that? So we're going to take a look at all those things today. Now, or tonight. First of all, I want to say that FDR had Hitler's number early on, and as Hitler began to create problems in Europe, and the Japanese began to create problems in the Pacific Rim, Roosevelt was really focused on the war that was going on in Europe. Now, one of the really cool things about history is that Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler come to power within about 6 weeks of each other, and they die within about 6 weeks of each other. So they're on the world stage at precisely the same time, this balance of good and evil. The difference was that after 7 or 8 years in office, Hitler was just really beginning to solidify his power and get ready to start the Second World War. After 7 or 8 years in office, Franklin Roosevelt was getting ready to retire the office, as every president had done, going all the way back to George Washington, right? Most of the folks just, they said, we're going to try for, not most of them, everybody said, we're going to try, I'll be president for 2 terms. And then after that, let somebody else have a chance. And that was a tradition that went all the way back to George Washington. But Roosevelt by 1939 said, well, this Hitler guy is not a good guy, and we're likely to have problems with him. And so it probably isn't a good time to be breaking in a new president. So I'm going to run for a 3rd term and sort of wait out this situation with Hitler. And I want to show you this. This is a copy of the flyleaf from FDR's copy of Mein Kampf. And this says, Franklin Roosevelt, White House, 1933. Now, notice this is 1933. This is, 6 or 7, 8 years before the war begins, certainly, and begins for the United States. Now, Roosevelt had read Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, My Struggle, in the original German. And he saw that there was a lot of anti-Semitism there, a lot of hatred, and a lot of trouble coming down the line. Now, he also happened to have gotten a copy of Mein Kampf in English. And when he read that, he said, this translation is expurgated so as to give a wholly false view of what Hitler really is and says. The German original would make a much different story. So Roosevelt, as early as 1933, sees that Hitler is a lot more evil than most people are taking him at face value to be. And he says, this guy, I don't know, he's putting this out over here, but if you were looking at what was really going on over in Germany, you would get an entirely different perspective on that. So he was keeping his eye on Hitler in Europe, and he was hoping that the British would be able to defeat the Nazis in Europe, and we wouldn't even have to get into the war. And he was doing everything he could to try to support the British with Lend-Lease and that sort of stuff. But the point was, we wanted to stay out of this war. Now, meanwhile, that's what's going on in Europe. Keep in mind that most people in the United States weren't paying attention to much of this at all. We were still in the throes of the Great Depression. Most people were worried about putting food on the table and, making sure that they could keep their jobs and hang on to their jobs. So they weren't really watching what was going on. Yeah, they were hearing about it in the newspapers, and, every now and then there'd be something in the newsreels about it. But most people's attention was directed at their immediate problem, which was still dealing with the Great Depression. Certainly the New Deal programs had brought relief, but they hadn't brought a cure at that point. Now, meanwhile, over in the Pacific, the Japanese were beginning to cause problems there as well. They had moved into Manchuria. They had moved into China. They were moving into many of the islands around the Pacific Rim. And the idea of this was that they were making war in that area. They wanted to create an empire in that part of the world. They had allied themselves with Hitler and also Mussolini. And these guys were allies with this. Now, the United States was selling great quantities of scrap steel and oil to the Japanese. Right? Great Depression, we're trying to make some money, so we're selling them surplus oil, we're selling them scrap metal, and what we're discovering is that they're using this material in their war effort. So in order to try to get them to not be so aggressive in that area, we cut off supplies of their oil and their scrap steel that the United States was selling to them in the summer of 1941. And this item right here is a Japanese Army helmet from World War II. So this will show you how desperate these guys were there in terms of getting material. This is made out of bamboo, ladies and gentlemen. It's held together with basically a vine up here, vine down here. It's held on the soldier's head with 2 pieces of bamboo that go this way and this way. You can see some Japanese lettering in here, and then it's held on the soldier's head by being tied on with the burlap here underneath the soldier's chin. The Japanese were so desperate for steel and oil that that's how bad it got. And they got to the point where they were making their helmets out of bamboo. So they knew this was not a good way to go, right? You can't, fight a war with bamboo army helmets. That's going to give you some protection, but it's not going to give you enough protection. So the United States said, all right, we're going to try to curtail Japanese aggression in the Pacific. We still believe that we could negotiate with the Japanese. And so, this idea that Roosevelt knew there was going to be problems with the Japanese, well, we were having problems with the Japanese, right? There was tension that was building there. But Roosevelt had a two-prong approach to dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific. Now, keep in mind, again, he's keeping his eye on Hitler in Europe. And Roosevelt's two-prong approach to the Japanese in the Pacific were this. Number one, continue diplomatic relations with relations and negotiations with Japan. And so the United States was negotiating with Japan, trying to ease the tensions, trying to get the tensions down. And we had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. So we were able to listen in on the dispatches coming from Tokyo to Washington, D.C., to the Japanese embassy. We were able to listen in on what messages were being sent through that. And the messages that were being sent through that were negotiate with the United States, calm this thing down, reduce the tension. We have to work together to try to get this stuff down, and we want a peaceful solution and resolution. So we were reading this through the diplomatic channels, and then the diplomats would come into the White House, come into the State Department, and they would say, we want to calm things down. We want to have things, chill out. We want to get rid of the tensions and such. We want a peaceful resolution to this. So we were reading the diplomatic codes, and the diplomatic codes were backing up exactly what the diplomats were saying in Washington. So we felt like we were getting an honest approach here, an honest, brokerage in terms of this negotiation. The problem was we had not broken the Japanese military codes at this time. And the Japanese military had decided they were going to go ahead with an attack on Pearl Harbor. And they never bothered intentionally, because they didn't want the secret to get out, to inform the diplomats. So the diplomats in Washington were negotiating in good faith with the United States to try to tamp down the tensions, while the military in Japan was planning the attack. So Roosevelt's first approach, let's continue negotiating, right? We can work something out here. We'll work something out. We'll stop selling them oil. We'll stop selling them steel because they're using that to make war, but we'll negotiate the rest of the way. That was one approach. The second approach that Roosevelt took was to build up the base at Pearl Harbor. And let me show you a map I've got here of the Pacific region. It'll be easier said than done. Okay, so here we have a map of the Pacific region. So here is the United States over here. Here is Japan over here, and Pearl Harbor is out here. As you can see, it's about a third of the way across the Pacific Ocean to Tokyo and over here to Japan. This was the largest military base outside of the United States, largest United States military base outside of the continental United States at that time. So Roosevelt said, all right, we've got this base out here. It's a naval base and it's also an army base. Let's continue to build this up. And what we'll do is we'll make this base strong enough so that we can project power into the Pacific, so that if the Japanese continue with this troublesome acts of waging war against their neighbors here, we'll be able to maybe contain them, or at the very least confront them and maybe get them to stop doing that. So the United States was building up this base at Pearl Harbor. Every day this was getting stronger, it was getting bigger, it was getting more sophisticated. And the Japanese said, okay, let's take a look at the situation. They've stopped selling us steel, they've stopped selling us oil. We need that in order to continue this movement across the Pacific Rim. This base is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the bigger it gets, the more it's going to be a problem for us. So the Japanese decided they were going to take this base out. So what the United States strategy was to build this up to be big enough to scare them into behaving. And what it did was it built up big enough to scare them into taking action. And that's what Japan did. So what they did was they sent their naval flotilla up here toward the Aleutian Islands, and then they came down the north into Pearl Harbor this way. They avoided this area of the Pacific Ocean out here because there are many islands and many sea shipping lanes, and they did not want to have their fleet discovered on the way to Pearl Harbor. This was part of the American strategy. We said, well, you know, we've got 2,000 miles of ocean here, actually 2,500 miles of ocean. If anything's coming this way, we're going to see it well before it gets here. And we were looking out that way. We were not looking north. So what the Japanese did was they did kind of a Hail Mary up here and down and then into the base here at Pearl Harbor. The idea of the Japanese was to knock out this base for 6 months to a year. And while this base was knocked out, they would then continue to move into their neighbors through here around the Pacific Rim with their eye on Australia, which had huge and enormous amounts of oil, steel, rubber, bamboo, and many other materials needed to make war. So the Japanese said, we'll knock this base out and then we'll have full reign here for a year. And by the time we get down here and get built up, by the time the United States gets back on its feet, we'll be too big and too powerful for them to prevent us from doing anything. So Roosevelt's two approaches were, number one, diplomatic negotiations, calm things down. Number two, peace through strength. We'll build up this big base that will scare the Japanese into doing what it is that we want them to do. It was a miscalculation on our part because what it did was it forced them to feel as if they had to attack the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now, there were some other misconceptions that were going on in our mind, and I'd like to point some of those out to you. One of them I've already kind of mentioned. This was a huge distance from Pearl Harbor all the way over to Japan. In fact, nobody had ever attacked over this length of distance anywhere in the world in the history of the world. So to think that any country could attack all the way across that distance was unthinkable, right? It's never happened before. It can't be done. That's what we were thinking. The Japanese said, well, if we need to take that base out, we'll find a way to do it. Another problem with this, the way this thinking was, is that we were building this up to be a very strong base. And we believed that if Japan ever did find a way to attack, and we didn't think they could over this long distance, but we thought that if they ever did take over Pearl Harbor, they would use it for exactly what we were using it for, except in reverse. So instead of us using it to project power into the Pacific Rim, we expected that if Japan ever did attack Pearl Harbor, they would take it over as an amphibious attack, and they would use it to take over the island, doing as little damage as possible, so they could then use it to project power into North America, Central America, and South America, and especially the Panama Canal, because that would allow them to get through here much quicker and much more easily than having to go all the way around. So we were prepared for an attack on Pearl Harbor Day. We were prepared for an attack. We were just simply prepared for the wrong attack. We expected there to be, if there was to be an attack, which we didn't believe could happen, there was this idea of groupthink. You know, Hawaii was a paradise. It was a beautiful tropical area. It was not a war zone, right? It was difficult for the folks that were there to imagine it being a war zone, right? That kind of stuff never happens here, right? We hear that all the time on the news whenever something, surprising and tragic happens, right? We never thought it could happen here. We never, that kind of thing never happens here. That's exactly what the folks on Pearl Harbor were thinking as well. And so that was one thing. The distance from Japan to Pearl Harbor, we didn't think anybody would be able to bridge that and go and attack that way. We had begun to set up some preliminary radar on the island of Pearl Harbor. the islands there in Hawaii, and radar had just pretty much been invented, and the folks that were using it, our technicians, were very inexperienced with it. And in fact, we didn't even have it turned on 24 hours a day. We would just turn it on for certain times through the day and, scan the horizon, see how things are going. And then we would turn it off and, just turn it on again later on when we felt that we needed to do this. Keep in mind also, this is a little known fact, but the United States was, I shouldn't say that, it's a little realized fact. The United States was ranked anywhere between 14th and 17th behind Portugal in military power on the morning of December 7th. So 80 years and a week ago, we were anywhere from 14 to 17 behind Portugal in military strength. After the First World War, we had let our military atrophy, right? We didn't keep up our Navy. We didn't keep up our Army. We had something like 500,000 men in uniform that morning in all of our military, and the Germans had 6 million men in uniform that morning. So the United States had become kind of a peacenik country, and we had let a lot of our military sort of fall apart in the time between the end of the First World War and the Second World War. And the reason we did that was because we didn't want to be a militaristic nation. Right? We wanted to not get involved in another war. In fact, there were laws passed, neutrality laws. There were laws passed about selling weapons to belligerent nations. And this is kind of what kept us from really supporting England the way we had wanted to. We ended up having to do things like Lend-Lease. The law said you couldn't sell weapons to belligerent nations, right? Nations that were in a war. But it didn't say you couldn't lend them or lease them. So Roosevelt found a way around that. So this is the situation that was going on in the world. Our military was unprepared because we had let it atrophied. The technology of radar was brand new, and we didn't really know how to use it effectively. There were actually reports of a squadron of planes coming in from the north about an hour and a half or so prior to the attack at Pearl Harbor. That information was passed up the chain of command, and when the mucky mucks saw this, they said, "Well, that's impossible. There's not going to be anybody coming from the north. Where the north is it's desolate ocean. You're probably just misreading it. It's probably a squadron of our planes coming in from the northwest." Or the northeast, I should say, coming out to the west to Pearl Harbor from the mainland. And so there was this report. Now, if this report had been taken seriously, we would have been able to get our planes up off the ground in time, but we weren't able to do that. So meanwhile, on the islands of Hawaii, as this base is getting bigger and bigger at Pearl Harbor, action was taken by our military leaders there that seemed like good actions at the time. It seemed like it made sense at the time. The guy who was in charge of the Army, because there was basically two units out there. There was the Army and there was the Navy. We didn't have an Air Force yet. The Air Force was part of the Army. So the General Stark, who was in charge of the Army base at Pearl Harbor, he was afraid because the base was rather large, right? It's getting bigger and bigger every day. And the planes were all spread out across this large acreage. He was concerned that if there were saboteurs on the island, that the saboteurs could take out these planes pretty quick and pretty easy because they were so spread out, they were hard to keep an eye on. So he ordered the planes to be not spread out, but to be brought in and clustered together so they could be more carefully guarded. Makes perfect sense if you're guarding against saboteurs. However, that's not who's going to attack us. It's going to be an air attack from the sky. And so by clustering those planes together, what he basically did was made a sitting duck target of our American Air Force, the Army Air Corps at that time. Meanwhile, Admiral Kimmel, who was in charge of the Navy out there at Pearl Harbor, he said, well, we're going to keep on our toes. And they went on this routine of regular trips and regular, routines, and what they did was they would go out on a Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. They would go out and they would do their maneuvers on this regular rotation, and then they would come back usually late Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. So they would go out, they would do these maneuvers on a Wednesday or Thursday. They would come back on Saturday. And the Japanese spies on the island said, this is a good idea. What we can do is we can attack on Sunday morning, because these guys come back late Saturday. They're tired. They're all on their ships. They're all, in their barracks. And if we want to attack, Sunday morning is a good time to do it. And that's exactly when the attack took place. So these two decisions, to cluster the planes, the decision to keep on a regular rotation, were good ideas at the time. However, here's my cat. However, they ended up not being good ideas when it came time for the Japanese to attack. The Japanese used that to their advantage. Now, the way the attack was planned was in 3 waves. The Japanese were going to come in the first wave, and they were going to knock out the air base. And the idea of that was to prevent us from getting our planes in the air to fight their bombers that were coming in and their torpedo planes, and also to prevent us from being able to get out over the sea and attack the fleet that the planes were flying from. So wave 1 of the attack, take out the air bases. Come to find out, much more easily done than they even had thought, because of this decision to cluster the planes. Wave number 2, come in and hit the battleships on Battleship Row. And there were over a dozen battleships there. That was the main objective, to cripple the American fleet out there in the Pacific, so that it would take us 6 months to a year to get back on our feet and back into the flow of combat out there. So thank you. And so then there was supposed to be wave number 3. And wave number 3 was supposed to come in and take out the repair facilities and what were called the tank farms. These were huge oil tanks out there on the Pacific Islands that we used to fuel our Navy. So wave 3 was supposed to come through, take out the repair facilities and these tank farms, thereby cutting off our supply to be able to resupply our ships with oil. Wave 1 comes through, works like a charm from the Japanese perspective. Wave 2 comes through, works like a charm from the Japanese perspective. Right? Over a dozen ships sunk or severely damaged. Wave number 3, for whatever reason, and nobody can seem to pinpoint a reason why, wave 3 was called off. And that was a huge stroke of luck for us, because what it did was it allowed us to use those undamaged repair facilities to repair the lesser damaged ships in the port. And it allowed us to refuel our aircraft carriers. We had 3 aircraft carriers at sea when the attack occurred. And so we were able to, once the attack was over, get the aircraft carriers in, refuel them, and then, we were in the war. So the Japanese plan to knock out the United States for 6 months to a year did not work. All it did really was galvanize American support behind the war, but galvanized support against for the war in Japan and in the Pacific, not against the war in Germany, which is what Hitler was persecuting over there, and what Roosevelt really wanted to be able to defend. Now, I want to show you a couple of documents, right? I said there's this conspiracy. So let me just, before I do that, let's just sort of circle our wagons. We're having trouble in the world, right? Hitler's in Europe. The Japanese are taking over the Pacific Rim. They're allies. We want to prevent this from happening. We're not in the war yet. Japan decides, okay, you know what? We're going to bring the United States into the war, because in their mind, they have to, because we stopped selling them steel, we stopped selling them oil, and we're building up this base that's getting more and more threatening. They feel they need to strike that base before it's too late, before it becomes so powerful that they're going to have to end up capitulating to us. We don't believe that there's going to be an attack, because the ocean is simply too far. Nobody's ever attacked that far before. It's a paradise. We're taking all these precautions, like keeping our planes together and being on a regular routine. We're flipping on and off the the radar and such. We're doing everything we think we can, and we're building up this base to prevent a problem there in the Pacific. But we misread the Japanese intentions, and the Japanese misread our intentions. We believe if there is going to be an attack, it will be an amphibious attack, an attack by water coming onto the land to take the base with as few casualties or damage to the site as possible, so it could then be used to project power into North and South America with a particular eye on the Panama Canal. So let me show you some documents. Now keep in mind there's thousands and thousands of documents floating around. I'm just going to show you a couple. They are representative of the kinds of documents that were floating around. I haven't, pre-selected these to prove a point one way or the other. Kitty cat. So here's how this is. So here is a memo, okay, a report, and it is saying that, okay, let's take a look at this. This is October 1941, right? October 15th. So just a couple of months out in front of the attack. And it looks as if the Japanese are headed north, right? So there was intelligence that was saying, hey, the Japanese are on the move. They're going to do something, but it looks like they're headed north. We don't have to worry. They're not coming our way. They're headed toward the bases in the north. Here is one, November 27th, 1941. And this is saying that the Japanese are headed south. So just a few weeks after that first attack, or not attack, that first memo, here's another intelligence report that says that the Japanese are not moving north, they are moving south. Well, which way are they moving? Are they moving north or are they moving south? Well, it's hard to say, right? They're kind of traveling in each of these directions. We're having evidence, we're having reports, we're having intelligence reports that are pointing in different directions. So depending upon who's reading these and who is evaluating these, you're getting different perspectives on how the attack is likely to take place. Here is an indication that we were thinking of this being an amphibious attack. Okay, so it says right here, that an amphibious expedition. So we were thinking, well, if there's going to be an attack, it's going to be a big attack because they're going to have to take over the island. So there'll be, won't just be aircraft carriers, it's going to be, troop transports and those sorts of things as well, because they're going to come on the island and they're going to begin to use it as we have been using it, except in the other direction. And then finally, I want to point out the document that all the conspiracy theorists point to when they talk about the attack at Pearl Harbor, and it's this one right here. And this is comes through the State Department, okay? And it's a telegram that's received, and I want to read it to you. And then I want to point out a couple of things. So it says here, my Peruvian colleague told a member of my staff that he had heard from many sources, including a Japanese source, that the Japanese military forces planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor using all of their military facilities. He added that although the project seemed fantastic, the fact that he had heard it from many sources prompted him to pass on the information. So what you're seeing here, again, is evidence of the things that I've been telling you, right? So this is what everybody points to say, look, see that? They said an attack on Pearl Harbor. But if you listen to this, right, they say it seems like it could be fantastic. So what that means is, nobody believes this is possibly happening. But if it is, they're going to attack Pearl Harbor. Also up here, there's this kind of language, in the event of trouble with the United States. Well, what does that mean, trouble? What does that mean? Does it mean stop not selling them oil and steel? Does it mean an attack from one of our planes or one of our ships on one of their planes or ships? Nobody, it doesn't define what's going to be likely to trigger this thing. So this is a very ambiguous document. in terms of, a Peruvian guy told a member of my staff that he'd heard this, so again, the old telephone chain, right? I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. And we know that by the time it gets down to the second or third, pass off, that the information is beginning to switch and change. But this is what everybody points to. See that right there? It says there's going to be an attack at Pearl Harbor. But look at the date on this, ladies and gentlemen. January 27th, 1941. This is a memo from a year out before the actual attack. So what this means is that even if this had been read, even if it had been taken seriously, we would have prepared for an attack, shortly coming up because, hey, there's this piece of report out, but that attack didn't come. And it didn't come, and it didn't come, and it didn't come until almost a year later. So that would be as if, somebody says, look, we're going to tell you, you better be careful. I'm going to get you, right? Well, the first couple of days, you're worried, you're looking around and everything, but you can't keep that vigilance up all the time. And if you do keep it up, you can only keep it up to a degree that you're able and capable of doing that, which means clustering your planes. Hey, if there's an attack, let's be careful. Hey, keep on a regular rotation, because if there's going to be an attack, we better be prepared. We better make sure our guys know what they're doing. So to point to this and say, well, see, there was going to be an attack at Pearl Harbor, and then, say that was the clear and conclusive evidence, it comes a year out. And it is inconclusive in terms of that. There are also other documents that say that there's going to be attacks at any number of places, Burma, the Philippines, all the rest of these sorts of places, pointing all different ways, all different shapes, all different sizes, and all different directions. So did Roosevelt know there was going to be an attack? He knew that there was likely to be trouble with Japan. We thought we were negotiating our way out of it. We thought that we were building up our military so that if there was a problem, we would be able to deal with it. We had conflicting reports going in all different kinds of directions. Say they're heading north, they're headed south, they're headed here, they're headed there. We have this report a year out that they're going to attack Pearl Harbor. An attack never occurs. So clearly, it's believed to be an erroneous report. And we are taking what we think are good steps to prevent this, keeping on a regular rotation, clustering our planes, turning on and off our radar, and we'll see what happens. We also didn't believe there could be an attack, simply too far a distance, and it's a tropical paradise. The wars doesn't take place in this kind of a place. These are all the sorts of problems and mindsets that were going on. So if Roosevelt's guilty of anything, right, he's guilty of allowing this groupthink to occur, within the military, that, this is impossible, it's not going to happen, there's no way it could happen. And in fact, as a direct result of the damage at Pearl Harbor, there was a huge congressional inquiry. I just want to show you two other things before we do that. So here is a telegram that was first sent about some of the first casualties and some of the first reports. So this is circulating in Washington 80 years ago in a week. And I know you can't read it, so I will read it to you, but I just wanted to show it to you. See, it says secret. And what it says here is commencing enemy air raids on fleet at Pearl Harbor, damage known to be great, though its fullest extent not determined. 3 battleships sunk, all others variously damaged, large proportion of planes destroyed on the ground, right? Destroyed on the ground, right there. That's the result of that bad decision to cluster those planes. And then it goes on to say, I'm searching enemy with all available planes and forces, carriers at sea undamaged. So that was good news. Then the White House from Washington puts out this telegram, and this goes out to all the various existing news sources at the time, right? New York Times, the Associated Press, those folks. And it says, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, the principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands. A second air attack is reported. This one has been made on an Army base and Navy base in Malaya. So what happens after this first attack is there's this sort of slow rollout drumbeat of these attacks over the next 48 hours or so. And here is a copy of a newspaper, war, Oahu bombed by Japanese planes. Now, as I started to say a minute ago, there was this huge congressional inquiry. What happened? How did this happen? Why weren't we prepared? Why weren't we more prepared? And, here is a political cartoon that shows this, this idea of, we weren't prepared. Okay. And the isolationists are saying this, and it's the Congress and such. And what they decided was that there were quite a number of mistakes that were made. There were miscalculations, there were misinterpretations, there were missed opportunities, like that radar that showed the planes coming in, and the careers of Admiral Kimmel and General Stark were destroyed. Right? They were kind of hung out to sort of bear the blame for this. You guys are on the ground out there. You guys are on the water. You should have been, taking better care. And instead, the actions you took actually, led to having this be more of a problem than it should have been. And as a direct result of this, a thing called the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was created. Because one of the problems that they discovered was, with all these different reports going in all these different directions, hey, they're going north, hey, they're going south, hey, a year out, they say they're going to attack, hey, an attack never occurred, hey, looks like everybody's, negotiating in good faith, hey, the military's, coming in from the north, all these various things. President Truman, when he became president, created a thing called the Central Intelligence Agency, which their job originally was to take all these reports from the various places, put the pieces together, see what the pieces create, what is the picture, and then present that to the president, so the president can then make decisions and have options about what to do. And of course, the president, Roosevelt, the very next day did this speech, the Day of Infamy speech. And if you look at this, it says yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in, and it originally said, give it a second to focus here, if it will. Are you going to focus for me? There we go. If you can look really closely, it says world history. President Roosevelt scratched it out and wrote infamy. And he did that because he didn't think world history had enough of a sexy tone to catch everybody's attention and such. So he said it's a date that will live in infamy. And in fact, it's done that, right? Here we are 80 years and a week later, and I'm talking to you over a technology that didn't even exist at that time about this day of infamy. Roosevelt knew it was going to live on. The other thing I like about this is two things. Number one is the first word in the sentence is yesterday. So President Roosevelt had 12 or 16 hours to think about what he wanted to do about this attack. It's not like today. If you remember back to the attack on September 11th, President Bush was meeting with, I think it was third graders in Sarasota, Florida, and they whisper in his ear, oh, there's a plane attack, right? And he didn't want to upset the kids, so he just continued on. And then a second guy came in, oh, there's been a second plane, right? And he still don't want to upset the kids. Finished the program, got off the stage, and immediately, Mr. President, what's going on? What's happening? What's going on? And he had to come up with like, and he didn't know anything much more than anybody else, right? The reports were still coming in. So Roosevelt, back in those days, because there wasn't this completely instant, communication, Roosevelt had 12 or 16 hours or so to think about how he wanted to address Congress. And then the other thing I love about this first sentence is, look, he puts a caret here and a dash, and he puts a dash over here. So when he gives this, what he's doing is he's giving himself stage direction as to how he wants to deliver this speech. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, dramatic pause, a date which will live in infamy, dramatic pause. The United States was subtly and deliberately attacked. So the next time you hear that speech, you'll hear the pause. That sentence hangs in the air, and that's exactly what President Roosevelt wanted to have happen. Immediate effect brought us into the war, but the war in the Pacific. Luckily, Hitler, being the fool that he was, declares war on the United States on December 11th. And so now we are in the war in the Pacific Rim and in Europe, and we're able to go, in both directions. Admiral Hirohito, almost immediately after the attack, said, what a stupid thing we just did. We have awoken a sleeping tiger. Would have been far better to leave that base out there and deal with it later than to launch that attack, bring the United States into the war, not have carried out wave 3, and allow the United States to get back on its feet in a pretty quick time and get back into that war. So that's what got us into the Second World War. Now, here's another very interesting fact, that we continue to have bad times in that war from December 7th, 1941, all the way into 1943. We had a lot of defeats and a lot of catching up to do, right? We're 14th behind Portugal. But within a year and a half, we become the arsenal of democracy, and we are supplying 80% of the munitions to the Allied forces. Within 4.5 years of the attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States is able to win the war, and we emerge with our allies, of course, England and the Soviet Union and the 26 other countries that were fighting on our side. And we emerge from the war as one of 2 major superpowers, certainly the dominant superpower. And so it was the American view that began to shape the post-war period and shape the way that the terms of the war came to an end. So that day, 80 years and 1 week ago, was critically important because A, it got us into that war, and then B, it propelled us into a position of world leadership that we've been in ever since. So was there a conspiracy to allow the attack at Pearl Harbor? There was no conspiracy. They were trying to do everything they could to prevent it from happening. Could they have been more careful about reading the signs and symptoms? Absolutely. They could have been, and they should have been. And the report that came out indicated that. And the action was taken to create the Central Intelligence Agency to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. But it's very hard going into something to predict what's going to happen. It's much easier after the fact when you can begin to connect the dots. Oh yeah, now it all makes sense. So we'll open it up to some questions and answers. Any questions, comments, snide remarks? Anybody? No? I'll give you a minute in case you're trying to unmute and such. So it was, it's a day of commemoration, really, and then it's a day of remembering those over 2,500 people died on Pearl Harbor Day. Over 1,100 died on one ship, the USS Arizona. 1,100 guys died on this ship on that morning, and terrible losses. Terrible tragedy, and got us into that war, and we were able to defeat the bad guys in doing that. Oh, great! I'm glad Claverack enjoyed. You guys are lots of fun up there. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that you guys are still teaching such biased lies about the last war in public. Interesting. I don't know who you mean, me or teachers. How was it decided? Oops, let's see. Let me go back to, this just jumped on here. Let me go back to the other one and I'll get back to this one in a second. If I can get my mouse to work. Here we go. Hold on a second here. How was it decided who would go to which front? Well, that's interesting. That's a good question. It basically is based upon need at any particular time. The folks that tended to go, and there was also some racism involved with that as well, because obviously, you wanted to send, like if there were Japanese Americans, you didn't want to send them to the Pacific Rim because, it would be difficult to fight there for that reason, with their ancestors having come from there and such. So they were primarily placed in the Mediterranean area. But basically it was divided, it was dependent upon need. Where do we need these guys to be? What are the objectives that we need to have? And of course, these things were constantly changing throughout the war. Here's one, let's see. With Japan's Pearl Harbor alone, there are lots of false facts in what you said. The FDR's Day of Infamy speech was completed 1 day before the attack. Yeah, okay, I'm not going to go here with this stuff because this has all been disputed. Interesting how certain facts are not mentioned when studying this. Always an interesting topic. Studying this in school in the 1960s and 70s. Yeah, it's interesting. This is why, primary source documents are so important, right? Because when you begin to look at these things, you begin to see that, there's documentation about this stuff. The question is, are the right people looking at these documents? Are the right people looking at these documents in a timely manner? Are they drawing the appropriate conclusions from these things? And, and then how does that impact the actions that they take and the actions that people take in response to that? It was perfectly logical what we were trying to do, with the Japanese in the Pacific Rim, which was tamp down tensions, negotiate, build up big so we could, try to get them to, behave in a more appropriate manner from our perspective. From their perspective, if we wait any longer, this base is going to get so big, we're going to have to capitulate to the United States. So, it all depends upon your perspective on these things from one way or the other. And, it's one of those sorts of things where, perspective over time helps you to generate some conclusions and such, as well. For example, the Japanese-American internment was a direct result of the attack at Pearl Harbor because the military was so unprepared. They didn't want to take that chance again. So they said, let's get all these guys off the West Coast and we'll be able to, we don't want a second Pearl Harbor kind of event sort of thing happening in that way. And, again, this idea of letting the Pacific Fleet get destroyed simply makes no sense, right? If I was going to fight with you, I would say, go ahead, throw the first punch, hit me right here, right? Because I want you to strike the first punch because then anything I do to you after that is self-defense, right? But I wouldn't say, here, break my neck. Go ahead and break my neck right here. And then I'll have an opportunity to fight back against you. You wouldn't allow your entire Pacific Fleet to be, virtually destroyed with the absence of those 3 aircraft carrier. And if you were using that as an excuse, you certainly could have used 1 or 2 simple ships to be shot down or sunk as an excuse to go forward from there. Let's see. They're all the primary sources.
Jeff, we have a question that says, please explain the reasoning behind bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay. Well, that is a little bit out of my bailiwick because I don't have, that was actually a decision that was made ultimately by the Truman administration. President Roosevelt was dead by that point. But basically the way that came to be was that the Nazis were working on an atomic bomb, and Albert Einstein ended up writing a letter to President Roosevelt saying, hey, there's this new form of energy that if you can harness this thing, it will produce such energy that one bomb can destroy an entire city. And this, of course, was mind-boggling in 1935, 36, 39, that sort of thing. But he writes this letter to President Roosevelt, and he says, and the Nazis are working on this. So that creates, the very next day, President Roosevelt starts the Manhattan Project to get the atomic bomb before the Germans did. And it wasn't operational in FDR's time. He died in April, and the first atomic bomb was not successfully tested until August. But then then we had 2 that were ready, the little boy and Fat Man. And Truman decided to go ahead and use these because the casualty projections for the casualty projections for an invasion of Japan, when you go back and you look at things like, Midway and Iwo Jima and these sorts of things, the Japanese were fighting to the last man to the death, right? They were not surrendering. And so if they're going to fight like that over a rock floating out in the ocean, imagine what they're going to fight like when we're attacking their homeland. So the idea was there was plans afoot to do another basically D-Day in the Pacific, but the atomic bombs became available, and the argument was that if we use these things, it will prevent the invasion. Yes, there will be hundreds of thousands of deaths, but we can probably prevent a million deaths if we end the war more quickly and sooner. And as I understand it, the cities were picked in part because they had not been bombed prior to the dropping of the atomic bombs, so that the effect of the bombs would be devastating, overwhelming, and clearly, unmistakable, so that the Japanese would clearly see that, wow, this is a super weapon, and we don't stand a chance. We need to quit and get out while we can. Let's see. Oh, thank you very much from Berkshires in the Massachusetts. Very nice. Look up about whole note. Okay, please explain the reason. We did that. Have you seen the memorial for the Arizona in Hawaii? Very moving. I have actually never been out there to see that. However, I have worked with the National Park Service out there that runs that memorial, and it's very, very moving. And you think about many of those guys are still entombed there, and the oil still bubbles up. It's just it really puts you in perspective of the vulnerability and the sacrifice these guys and gals did. As it came through. Okay. All righty. And some debate about Truman and the bomb. That's beyond my bailiwick. You can take that up with the folks out at the Truman Presidential Library. And anything else? Let's see new messages. Any Zooms that show the memorial? Gee, I don't know. That would be, you'd have to check with the National Park Service out in Hawaii. And I'm sure they have a website. If you just, do the Pearl Harbor Memorial, you can talk with somebody out there whether or not they have, a presentation similar to this. And they might be able to do that for you. Okay, so as always, my pleasure to present for you, and I hope you have a little bit better understanding of what went down out there and what the thinking was, and the sort of lead up to that. Very tragic situation, but ultimately from that came the end of the war. And the defeat of Hitler, and the creation of the post-war period. And thank goodness we have not had a third world war since the Second World War. So the creation of the United Nations, although it's imperfect in what it's been able to do, certainly has not allowed there to be a third world war. Okay, so we will see you again sometime soon, I'm sure. In the meantime, continue on having a safe and happy holiday season, and we will see you again sometime down the line. Thank you.